I have to go. You cannot stop me from providing medical care.
Resisting arrest!
Arrest!
Turn around!
Arrest! For what? For doing my job?
The scream of tortured metal had faded, replaced by a symphony of human suffering. On the sun-scorched asphalt of Interstate 10, just west of the city, the afternoon light glinted off a chaotic mosaic of shattered glass and twisted steel. A 5-car pileup had turned the westbound lanes into a junkyard. Horns blared from the miles-long traffic jam behind them, an impatient chorus oblivious to the life-and-death ballet unfolding at the scene. In the heart of it all was Sarah Jones. For 17 years as a paramedic, chaos had been her office, and she moved through it with a focus that bordered on serene. Her mind filtered out the noise, the distant sirens of approaching fire trucks, the weeping of a woman from a dented sedan, the shouts of uninjured motorists. All that existed for her was the man pinned behind the steering wheel of a crumpled pickup truck. His name, she'd learned from a frantic co-worker who had been following him, was David Henderson. He was in his late 40s, a construction foreman, and his chest was crushed against the steering column. His breathing was a shallow, gurgling rasp. His skin had a waxy, pale quality that screamed internal bleeding. Sarah and her partner, Mark, had been the first medical unit on scene. They had parked their ambulance, Unit 34, at an angle, a 2-ton metal shield protecting the most critical part of the scene from the risk of another collision. It was standard procedure, a textbook maneuver to create a safe workspace. Mark was coordinating with the first firefighters arriving, preparing the jaws of life, while Sarah had slipped through the shattered driver's side window to reach her patient. "David, can you hear me?" she said. Her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the mayhem around them. Her gloved fingers were already on his neck, finding a pulse. It was there, but it was weak and fast, a frantic drumbeat signaling his body was losing a war. "My name is Sarah. I'm a paramedic. We're going to get you out of here." There was no response, only a faint moan that bubbled up with a pinkish froth on his lips. Pulmonary contusion, possibly a flail chest. Her mind was a rapid-fire checklist of potential injuries. Aorta, spleen, liver, the unholy trinity of blunt force trauma. Every second that ticked by, his chances of survival diminished. This was the golden hour, that critical window after a traumatic injury, and the clock was bleeding out. She worked with an economy of motion honed by thousands of calls just like this one. She established a large-bore IV in his arm, a vital lifeline to push fluids and medication. She checked his pupils. They were sluggish. She carefully fitted a cervical collar around his neck to protect his spine. Through it all, she spoke to him, a steady, reassuring monologue. "Okay, David, the fire department is here now. They're going to cut this door off so we can get you out. It's going to be loud, but that means we're making progress." The shriek of the hydraulic rescue tool cutting through the truck's A-pillar was deafening. But Sarah didn't flinch. Her world had shrunk to the space inside that mangled cab, to the failing vital signs of the man entrusted to her care. Mark appeared at the window, his face grim. "They've got the door almost off. How's he doing?" he yelled over the noise. "He's crashing. Mark, BP is dropping. We need to move the second we get him out. Have the backboard and stretcher ready. I want to be rolling the instant he's secured." Mark nodded, his expression communicating a perfect understanding. They had been partners for 6 years, a seamless unit that operated on a mixture of training, instinct, and unspoken trust. He vanished back into the organized chaos. The door finally gave way with a groan and was pulled aside. The path was clear. "All right, David, here we go." Sarah murmured, shifting her position to help the firefighters maneuver the backboard. They worked as a team, a careful, synchronized effort to extricate him without causing further injury. As they began to slide him out, Sarah saw the police cruisers arriving. Good, she thought. They needed traffic control, scene security. It was a normal part of the process. An officer was approaching, his boots crunching on the debris field. He was young, his face set in a hard line of authority, his hand resting near his sidearm. He walked with a swagger that spoke more of ego than experience. Sarah registered his presence, but immediately returned her focus to her patient. They had David on the backboard now, lifting him toward the waiting stretcher. His eyes fluttered open for a brief, terrifying second, filled with a mixture of pain and confusion before rolling back into his head. His breathing hitched. "He's agonal," Sarah said urgently to Mark. "Let's move, now!" They began to push the stretcher at a fast clip toward the open doors of their ambulance. The officer was walking parallel to them, his gaze not on the critically injured patient, but on their vehicle. "This your ambulance?" he called out, his voice sharp. Sarah ignored him, her hands busy adjusting the oxygen mask on David's face. "Ma'am, I'm talking to you," the officer insisted, his tone hardening. Mark glanced over, annoyed. "We've got a critical patient here. Officer." The officer stopped, planting his feet. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "You're blocking the lane. I need you to move this truck. Now!" Sarah didn't stop moving. She and Mark had reached the back of the ambulance and were preparing to lift the stretcher. "We can't move the vehicle." "Officer," Sarah said without looking at him, her voice tight with concentration. "We're in the middle of loading a critical trauma patient. The vehicle is positioned for scene safety." Her words were precise, professional, and devoid of emotion. They were a statement of fact, not an argument. In the world of emergency services, there was a clear hierarchy in these moments. Medical priority superseded all else. A police officer's need for a clear traffic lane did not outweigh a paramedic's need to save a life. It was a principle so fundamental that she didn't give it a second thought. This officer, however, clearly operated in a different world. "I didn't ask for an explanation. I gave you an order," he snapped. His voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with an impatience that was dangerously out of place. "Move the ambulance." This time, Sarah paused. She and Mark held the stretcher, the patient precariously balanced between the ground and the ambulance floor. She finally turned her head and looked directly at him. His name tag read N. Miller. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a military-style haircut and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual glare. He wasn't looking at the patient on the stretcher, whose life was visibly draining away. He wasn't assessing the complex and dangerous accident scene. His entire focus was on her, a black woman who had failed to provide immediate, unquestioning obedience. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice dropping into a lower, firmer register. "My patient is hemodynamically unstable. He is dying. We are loading him for immediate transport to the trauma center. Moving this ambulance would involve getting in the cab, starting the engine, and repositioning, which would take several minutes we do not have. My duty right now is to this patient. Your unit can block the traffic behind us." She had laid it out perfectly. The medical necessity, the legal and ethical duty, the practical alternative. She had given him a clear, professional reason for her actions. To any reasonable officer, the conversation would have ended there. But Officer Miller was not engaged in a reasonable conversation. He was engaged in a contest of wills, and he had no intention of losing. "Are you refusing a lawful order, ma'am?" he asked, taking a deliberate step closer. The word "ma'am" was coded in condescension. Mark shifted his weight, sensing the sudden, dangerous turn. "Look, man," Mark started. "We're just trying to do our job. This guy is circling the drain." Miller ignored Mark completely, his eyes locked on Sarah. It was a laser focus, an exclusion of everyone and everything else at the scene. He saw a challenge, and in his mind, that challenge needed to be crushed. "My job is to secure this scene," Miller said, his voice rising, "and your vehicle is in the way. I don't know what part of that you don't understand." Sarah felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. She had dealt with difficult officers before, arrogant, stressed, even incompetent ones. But this was different. This wasn't about the job. It was personal. She could feel the palpable wave of resentment coming off him. He wasn't just an officer enforcing a command. He was a man demanding submission. She made a decision. Her patient came first. Always. "Mark, let's lift on 3, she said, turning her back to Miller completely. 1, 2, 3. They hoisted the stretcher, sliding it into the locking mechanism inside the ambulance. It was a decisive, final movement. She had made her choice. She was choosing her patient. That act of turning her back, of prioritizing her duty over his demand, was the final straw for Officer Miller. She heard his heavy footsteps on the asphalt behind her. "I said, move the ambulance," he shouted, his voice now raw with fury. "I'm not telling you again. And I am telling you, officer, that I have a legal and moral obligation to my patient," Sarah replied, stepping up into the ambulance without turning around. "We are leaving now. You can file a complaint with my supervisor if you feel I've acted improperly." She reached for the telemetry radio to call the hospital, to give the incoming trauma report that would set the life-saving machine of the emergency room in motion. She was back in her world, the world of medicine, protocols, and saving lives. She assumed he would bluster, maybe take down her unit number, but ultimately, he would have to let her go. She was wrong. A hand clamped down on her bicep, hard. The grip was powerful, meant to control and intimidate. She was yanked backward, pulled off the step of the ambulance. She stumbled, catching her balance on the bumper, her heart pounding with a sudden jolt of disbelief and adrenaline. The radio handset clattered to the floor. The world seemed to slow down. The grip on her arm was a vice, and Officer Miller spun her around to face him. His face was inches from hers, contorted in a mask of rage. "You don't get to walk away from me," he snarled. The transformation was shocking. He was no longer a public servant. He was an aggressor. All pretense of professional conduct had vanished, replaced by raw, unchecked power. Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process the assault. She was a paramedic at a critical incident scene, actively treating a dying patient, and she was being physically manhandled by a police officer. It was a violation of every protocol, every interagency agreement, and every basic standard of human decency. "Let go of my arm, officer," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. "You're obstructing my investigation," he said, his voice low and menacing. He was already building his justification. "You've been uncooperative from the moment I arrived." "My patient is dying." Sarah's voice finally cracked with the sheer frustration and disbelief of the situation. She gestured with her free hand toward the back of the ambulance where Mark was now frantically trying to re-establish the IV line she had started, his face a mask of horror. "My patient is dying, and you are stopping me from saving his life." The logic was irrefutable. The evidence was right there, on a stretcher, gasping for air. But Miller was beyond logic. He was operating on pure ego. The crowd of onlookers, previously just a backdrop of shocked faces, was now moving closer. Cell phones were raised, dozens of them, their small black lenses silently recording every second of the confrontation. The scene was no longer just an accident. It was a spectacle. A firefighter captain, a veteran with salt and pepper hair and a face etched with the memory of 1,000 bad calls, started walking toward them. "Officer, what's going on here? She needs to transport that patient immediately." Miller shot him a venomous look. "Stay out of this. Captain, this is a police matter." The captain stopped, his expression hardening. He knew he was witnessing something profoundly wrong, a line being crossed that should never be crossed. But he also knew that escalating with an officer this enraged could make things worse. Mark's voice came from the ambulance, desperate. "Sarah, I'm losing him. His pressure is bottoming out." The words were a physical blow to Sarah, while Miller was playing king on his asphalt chessboard. David Henderson was dying. She tried to pull her arm away, a desperate instinct to get back to her patient. "I have to go. You cannot stop me from providing medical care." That movement, that assertion of her duty, sealed her fate. To Miller, it was resistance. "You're resisting arrest," he said, the words sounding absurd even as he spoke them. "Arrest? For what? For doing my job?" she cried out, her voice a mixture of outrage and despair. He didn't answer. Instead, with his other hand, he reached for his handcuffs. The metallic rasp of the cuffs being pulled from their pouch was a sickening sound. It was the sound of everything going wrong. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered. Sarah stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. This was a nightmare. She looked past Miller's shoulder at the sea of phones, at the horrified faces of the firefighters, at the ambulance where her partner was fighting a losing battle for a man's life. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of helplessness, but it was immediately followed by a surge of defiant anger. She would not be a prop in this officer's power fantasy. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not. My patient needs me." Miller's face went crimson. He yanked her arm with incredible force, twisting it behind her back. The pain was sharp and immediate. She cried out as he forced her body forward, off balance. He shoved her against the side of the ambulance, the cold metal a shock against her cheek. "I said, you are under arrest," he yelled, his spittle hitting her face. The other cuff came out. He wrenched her free arm behind her back, forcing her wrists together. The first cuff clicked shut, the cold steel biting into her skin, then the second. The sound was final, a sharp, metallic punctuation mark on an act of madness. She was in handcuffs, in her uniform, at the scene of a medical emergency, in front of her patient, her partner, her colleagues, and a crowd of strangers who were capturing her utter humiliation for the world to see. A tear of pure rage and sorrow slid down her cheek. "My patient," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Someone help my patient." From inside the ambulance, Mark's voice was a desperate shout. "He's coding! I need help in here! He's in V-fib!" David Henderson was in cardiac arrest, and the paramedic, who was his best chance at survival, was in handcuffs, leaning against the side of the vehicle that was supposed to be his salvation. The call of "he's coding" sent a jolt through the trained professionals on the scene. It was the ultimate medical distress signal, the moment a crisis becomes a catastrophe. For Mark, alone in the back of the ambulance, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. He slammed the button on his radio. "Unit 34 to dispatch. Patient is in cardiac arrest. I need another ALS unit here now. Code 3. He ripped open David's shirt, placed the defibrillator pads on his chest, and turned the machine on. The electronic voice was chillingly calm. Analyzing rhythm. Do not touch the patient. Mark's hands hovered over David's chest, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He was one person trying to do the work of two, and he was failing. The protocols for cardiac arrest were a synchronized dance, requiring one person to manage the airway, another to do compressions, another to administer drugs. He was alone. "Shock advised," the machine intoned. "Clear!" Mark yelled to the empty space around him, pressing the orange button. David's body arched off the stretcher as the electricity surged through him. Mark immediately started chest compressions, putting his full body weight into the rhythmic, brutal task of forcing a heart to beat. He was sweating, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed help. Outside, the scene had fractured. The firefighter captain, hearing Mark's desperate call, abandoned his standoff with Miller and scrambled toward the ambulance. "What do you need?" he shouted, his face grim. "I need someone to bag him." Mark grunted between compressions. The captain grabbed the bag valve mask and began squeezing air into David's lungs, a clumsy but vital rhythm. Still, it wasn't enough. They were losing him. Officer Miller seemed momentarily stunned by the turn of events. He stood with Sarah still held by the arm, the handcuffs a grotesque symbol of his priority. The sound of a man going into cardiac arrest just feet away finally seemed to penetrate his bubble of rage. He looked from Sarah to the frantic activity in the ambulance, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But it was too late for second thoughts. He had committed to this course of action, and backing down now would be an admission of a catastrophic error. He tightened his grip on Sarah and began marching her toward his patrol car. "You see what you did?" he hissed at her, the blame in his voice absolute. "This is your fault. You should have complied." The accusation was so ludicrous, so completely detached from reality, that Sarah could only stare at him in stunned silence. She had been arrested for trying to prevent this very outcome. As Miller shoved her into the back of his cruiser, the wail of another siren grew louder. The backup ambulance Mark had called for was arriving. It swerved to a stop behind their unit, and two new paramedics, a man and a woman Sarah recognized from another station, jumped out, their faces set with urgency. They took one look at the scene, Mark and a firefighter doing CPR in one ambulance, Sarah in handcuffs in a police car, and their expressions shifted from urgency to utter confusion. But there was no time for questions. They grabbed their gear and ran to help Mark. Sarah watched through the grimy plexiglass partition of the patrol car. She saw the new medics take over, their movements swift and efficient. One intubated David, securing his airway. The other took over compressions. Mark, exhausted and relieved, began drawing up epinephrine. It was the team she and Mark should have been. It was the care David should have had from the beginning. The delay was unforgivable. They had lost at least 4 minutes from the moment Miller had confronted her to the moment the new crew was able to start effective. Multi-person CPR. In the calculus of cardiac arrest, 4 minutes was an eternity. For every minute without CPR and defibrillation, a person's chance of survival drops by 10%. Miller had single-handedly stolen nearly half of David Henderson's chances. She watched as they worked on him for several more minutes, shocking him again. Finally, they got a rhythm back. It was weak, unstable, but it was a pulse. They slammed the ambulance doors and sped away, sirens screaming, leaving a void of silence in their wake. Miller got into the driver's seat of the patrol car, the engine rumbling to life. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his radio. "Dispatch. Show me en route to central booking with one adult female in custody." The casual, bureaucratic language was obscene. It was the sound of a system that could so easily process an injustice, package it in codes and jargon, and file it away. Sarah leaned her head back against the hard plastic seat, the handcuffs digging into her wrists. She felt a profound, soul-crushing coldness spread through her. A man's life, a family's future, had just been irrevocably damaged. and the person responsible was driving her to jail, convinced he was the one who had been wronged. The 12-minute drive to the city's central booking facility was a study in suffocating silence. The air in the patrol car was thick with the unspoken. Officer Miller drove with a rigid posture, his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The occasional crackle from his radio was the only sound that broke the tension. Sarah sat in the back, her mind a maelstrom of fury and fear. She replayed the encounter over and over, searching for a different choice she could have made, a different word she could have used to de-escalate the situation. But every path led back to the same impossible choice: abandon her patient or defy a police officer who saw compliance as the only virtue. She had chosen her patient, and this was the consequence. She focused on her breathing, a technique she used on countless patients to calm their panic. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. She tried to detach herself, to become an observer of her own absurd predicament, but the cold, tight bite of the handcuffs was a constant physical reminder of her powerlessness. They were a brand, marking her not as a healer, but as a criminal. When they arrived at the sally port of the booking center, Miller finally spoke. "Don't make this any harder on yourself," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the earlier rage. It was the hollow tone of a man who had already completed his internal report, one in which he was the calm professional and she was the hysterical. Non-compliant obstacle. He led her inside. The air was stale, smelling of antiseptic and despair. The booking area was a large, brightly lit room with linoleum floors and cinderblock walls. Several other officers were processing arrests, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. As Miller walked her toward the intake desk, a ripple of recognition went through the room. Heads turned, conversations paused. Sarah was not a stranger here. She had brought patients to the facility's infirmary dozens of times. She had coordinated with these same officers on overdose calls, domestic violence scenes, and psychiatric emergencies. She was a familiar face, a colleague from a different branch of the same emergency response tree. An older, heavy-set sergeant named Kowalski looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Miller, what in God's name is this?" he asked, gesturing toward Sarah. "That's Sarah Jones from Station 12. Miller's jaw tightened. He placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of ownership. "She's in my custody, Sarge. Obstruction of a governmental operation and resisting arrest." Kowalski's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Miller's defiant face to Sarah's exhausted and bruised one. He had worked the streets for 25 years. He knew a bad arrest when he saw one, and this reeked of it. "Obstruction?" Kowalski repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "She was on that pile-up on I-10, wasn't she? What was she obstructing? A chance for her patient to die." The sarcasm was thick, but Miller didn't back down. "She refused a direct, lawful order to clear the scene?" Kowalski just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He knew Miller's reputation. Young, aggressive, with a chip on his shoulder, an officer who saw every interaction as a test of his authority. The booking process began. It was a methodical stripping away of identity. Her pockets were emptied, her wallet, her keys, her phone. The contents were placed in a large plastic bag. The booking officer, a young woman who looked barely out of her 20s, cataloged each item. She paused when she pulled out Sarah's wallet and saw her paramedic certification and her fire department ID. She glanced up at Sarah, a flicker of empathy in her eyes, before quickly looking down again and continuing her work. Then came the fingerprints. The ink was cold and greasy as her fingers were rolled across the paper. capturing the unique ridges that now defined her as an entry in a criminal database. Then the photograph. Face the camera, no smiling. The flash was a blinding white, capturing a moment of profound degradation. Sarah Jones, decorated paramedic, 17 years of service, lifesaver, now reduced to a mugshot. They took the handcuffs off only to replace them with a plastic wristband bearing her booking number. She was led to a small, concrete holding cell. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening clang, the sound of finality. She was alone. She sat on the cold metal bench and finally let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep, burning rage. The system she had dedicated her life to, the system she worked alongside every single day, had turned on her in the most brutal and public way. She had been arrested for doing her job. She had been humiliated for prioritizing a human life. Outside the cell, she could hear Kowalski's voice, low and angry, talking to Miller. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. The old sergeant was dressing him down, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The report was being written. The machine was in motion, and she was caught in its gears. Mark hadn't waited. The moment the second ambulance crew had stabilized David Henderson and left the scene, he had been on his personal cell phone, his hands still trembling with adrenaline. His first call was to their battalion chief, a man named Henderson, no relation to the patient, who listened in stunned silence as Mark recounted the events, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Henderson's response was immediate and furious. "Stay where you are. Mark, I'm on my way. Don't talk to any other cops." His second call was to their union president, Frank Gallo. Frank was a former firefighter, a gruff, old-school brawler who had spent the last decade fighting battles for his members in boardrooms and courtrooms instead of burning buildings. He listened to Mark's frantic explanation without interruption. When Mark finished, there was a moment of silence on the line. Then Frank's voice came, low and dangerous. "Where did they take her? Central booking? I'm calling Ben Carter. Sit tight." The name Ben Carter was a weapon. In the city's legal circles, Benjamin Carter was a legend, a civil rights attorney who had spent 30 years taking on cases of police misconduct, wrongful arrest, and racial discrimination. He was brilliant, relentless, and had a reputation for eviscerating overconfident officers on the witness stand. He was the lawyer a corrupt police department had nightmares about. He was precisely the lawyer Frank Gallo kept on retainer for moments like this. Frank's call reached Carter as he was packing his briefcase to leave his downtown office for the day. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ben, it's Frank. We have a situation. One of my best paramedics, a black woman with a spotless record, was just arrested on the scene of a major MVA. Arrested for trying to treat a critical patient. They've taken her to Central." Carter stopped what he was doing. He leaned back against his desk, the phone pressed to his ear. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying intensity that signaled he was already shifting into battle mode. Frank gave him the details Mark had provided, the pileup, the critical patient, the young officer, the absurd demand to move the ambulance, and the arrest. Carter listened, his mind already assembling the legal framework for the fight ahead: unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment, violation of due process, interference with the provision of emergency medical services, a specific state-level offense, and underlying it all, the unmistakable stench of racial bias. "I'm on my way to the precinct now," Carter said when Frank was done. "Tell her partner to write down every single detail he remembers, every word, every action, every timestamp, and tell him not to lose the numbers of any witnesses who saw it. I'll call you the second I have her out." Carter arrived at Central Booking less than 30 minutes later. He walked into the station not with the swagger of a hotshot lawyer, but with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who knew the terrain intimately. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, but his eyes were those of a street fighter. He bypassed the public counter and walked straight to the booking desk where Sergeant Kowalski was finishing his shift. "Sergeant," Carter said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm Benjamin Carter. I'm here to see my client, Paramedic Sarah Jones." Kowalski looked up, a flicker of relief on his tired face. He had been dreading the inevitable internal affairs nightmare that was about to descend. The arrival of Ben Carter meant the problem was now bigger, but also clearer. "Counselor," Kowalski nodded, "I was expecting you." "I want to see my client now," Carter stated, "and I want a copy of the arresting officer's preliminary report." "He's still writing it," Kowalski grumbled, gesturing toward a desk where Officer Miller was hunched over a keyboard, typing furiously. Carter's gaze drifted over to Miller. He studied the young officer for a long moment, taking in the rigid posture and the defensive set of his jaw. Carter had seen 100 officers just like him. Young, insecure, and intoxicated by the power of their uniform. They were the ones who caused the most damage. "Let me be clear, Sergeant," Carter said, his voice dropping but losing none of its authority. "My client was performing her legal duty to provide emergency medical care. Her arrest was not only unlawful, it was a dangerous and reckless act that directly endangered a civilian's life. I want her released on her own recognizance immediately. If I have to call a judge to get a writ, I promise you, the fallout for your department will be severe." Kowalski held up his hands. "No need for that. Counselor, I'm signing off on her release right now. This whole thing is a mess." He knew a losing battle when he saw one. Keeping Sarah Jones in a cell a minute longer, especially with Ben Carter on the premises, was indefensible. He walked over to the holding cells, keys jingling in his hand. The wheels of justice had been jammed by ego and prejudice, but now, with the right pressure, they were beginning to grind forward again. The heavy cell door swung open with a screech of metal on metal. Sarah looked up, startled, to see Sergeant Kowalski standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of apology and exhaustion. "You're free to go, Sarah," he said quietly. "Your lawyer's here." The words took a moment to register. Lawyer? She hadn't called anyone. Then she realized Mark, Frank, the union. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone in this. She followed Kowalski back to the booking desk where Ben Carter was waiting. He extended a hand. "Sarah Jones, I'm Ben Carter. Frank Gallo sent me. I'm sorry we had to meet under these circumstances." His handshake was firm, his eyes direct and intelligent. In a world that had suddenly turned upside down, he was an anchor of calm competence. The process of being released was surreal. The young officer who had booked her in now handed back the plastic bag with her belongings, her gaze refusing to meet Sarah's. Sarah signed the paperwork for her property and her OR release bond without a word. As Carter was gathering the documents, Officer Miller stood up from his desk and walked past them, heading for the locker room. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't acknowledge her presence. It was an act of deliberate erasure, as if she were a problem that had been processed and filed away. The arrogance was breathtaking. He had ruined her day, endangered her patient, and assaulted her dignity. And he walked away as if he'd just finished a routine traffic report. The cold fury inside Sarah solidified into something harder, more resolute. This wasn't over. She walked out of the station's front doors and into the now fading afternoon light. Mark was there, leaning against the side of a fire department SUV, his face etched with worry. Their battalion chief, Henderson, stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression thunderous. Mark rushed forward, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," she said, managing a weak smile. "What about our patient? What about David?" Mark's face fell. The grim reality of the situation rushed back in, eclipsing her own ordeal. "It's bad. Sarah, it's really bad," he said, his voice low. "He coded for almost 2 minutes before we got him back. They took him to University Medical. I called the ER charge nurse a little while ago." He took a deep breath. "The trauma from the crash caused a tear in his aorta. The drop in blood pressure from the delay, it caused the tear to rupture completely in the ambulance. He was bleeding out internally. They rushed him straight into surgery." Sarah's stomach plummeted. An aortic rupture. It was one of the most lethal injuries imaginable. A catastrophic event with a slim chance of survival even under the best of circumstances. "Is he—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "He's alive," Mark said quickly. "He made it through the surgery, but just barely. The surgeon told the nurse it was touch and go the whole time. He's in the surgical ICU now, in a medically induced coma. They don't know if he'll have any brain damage from the time he was in arrest. They're saying the next 24 hours are critical." The weight of the words crushed her. The delay. Those precious, squandered minutes while Officer Miller asserted his authority were the minutes in which a small tear had become a full-blown rupture. Miller hadn't just arrested her. He had potentially handed David Henderson a death sentence, or at best, a life irrevocably altered. Ben Carter, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. He had overheard the diagnosis, and his expression was grim. "This changes everything," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "This is no longer just a case of an unlawful arrest. This is a case where an officer's actions led to a catastrophic, life-threatening medical outcome for a civilian." He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze unwavering. "The city will try to blame the accident, the fog of the scene. They will do everything they can to protect this officer and deflect responsibility. Our job is to not let them—" Sarah looked back at the cold, impersonal facade of the police station. What had happened inside was a personal humiliation, but what she had just learned about David Henderson, that was an obscenity. Her personal fight was now inextricably linked to his fight for life. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, the earlier tears replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Carter allowed a small, grim smile. "Now," he said, "we make them pay." 2 days later, Sarah sat in a leather armchair in Ben Carter's corner office. The room was lined with law books and framed commendations, but the real story was told through the large windows overlooking the city skyline. It was a view from a position of power, earned through decades of fighting for those who had none. Sarah, however, felt anything but powerful. She had been placed on administrative leave, a standard procedure that felt like a punishment. She hadn't slept, haunted by the image of David Henderson's ashen face and the sound of Miller's voice. The news from the hospital was grimly static. Henderson remained in a coma, his condition critical but stable. His family was keeping a vigil, living a nightmare that Officer Miller had authored. "They're going to come at you from every angle," Carter said, leaning forward in his chair. He wasn't sugarcoating it. "They'll dig into your entire 17-year career, looking for any complaint, any minor write-up. They'll talk to former partners, old supervisors. They'll try to paint you as insubordinate, difficult, an angry black woman who doesn't respect authority. That's their playbook. It's ugly, and it's predictable. Sarah nodded slowly. She had expected as much. My record is clean, she said. I do my job. I follow my protocols. I know, Carter said, and that's why we will win. But you need to be prepared for the personal cost. They will try to break you. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. There are two paths here. We can pursue a settlement negotiation now, quietly. The city would likely offer a decent sum to make this go away before it gets messier, especially with the videos that are all over the news. We could probably secure a high six-figure amount, get your record expunged, and you could go back to work. The other path is to fight. We file a federal civil rights lawsuit. We take this into open court. It will be longer, more expensive, and much more public. It will be a war. Sarah thought of David Henderson, lying in a hospital bed, tubes keeping him alive. She thought of Officer Miller, who was, as far as she knew, still on active duty. A quiet settlement felt like a betrayal. It would be a business transaction, a way for the city to cut its losses while changing nothing. It would leave Miller on the street, free to endanger another patient, another paramedic. It's not about the money, she said, her voice firm. He can't be allowed to do this again. No paramedic should ever have to choose between their patient and a pair of handcuffs. We fight. Carter's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw a flicker of deep respect in his eyes. He had presented the choice as a neutral one, but he was a fighter, and he had been hoping she would choose the battlefield. Good, he said simply. Then that's what we'll do. The lawsuit was filed the following Monday. The document, a meticulously crafted 40-page complaint, was a declaration of war. Sarah Jones versus Officer Nathan Miller and the city name. It was filed in the United States District Court, elevating the case from a simple dispute to a constitutional challenge. The causes of action were laid out in stark, powerful language. Count 1, violation of the Fourth Amendment for unlawful seizure and false arrest. Count 2, violation of the 14th Amendment for deprivation of liberty without due process. Count 3, a specific and potent state law claim for interference with emergency medical services. But it was the fourth count that made the city's lawyers truly nervous. Count 4, a Monell claim, alleging that the city itself was liable because the incident was not the result of a single rogue officer, but of a pattern of inadequate training and a culture of tacitly approving the use of excessive force and intimidation, particularly against minorities. This claim aimed not just at Miller, but at the entire police department's institutional culture. The filing was a bombshell. The local news, which had already been covering the viral videos of the arrest, now had a massive new angle. The story was picked up by national news outlets. Sarah's face and the humiliating images of her arrest were broadcast across the country. She became an unwilling symbol to some. She was a hero, a professional who stood her ground. To others, egged on by police union statements defending Miller's difficult decisions in a chaotic environment, she was an arrogant public employee who thought she was above the law. The city was officially served with the lawsuit. The clock had started. They had 21 days to respond. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just about a confrontation on a highway. It was about where the authority of a badge ended and the duty to save a life began. And the whole country was now watching to see which would prevail. The city's response to the lawsuit was predictable and immediate. Publicly, the police chief held a press conference. He stood at a podium, flanked by the city attorney, and spoke in vague, cautious platitudes. He promised a full and thorough internal investigation, emphasized the department's deep respect for our partners in the fire department, and asked the public to avoid rushing to judgment. He never mentioned Officer Miller by name. Privately, however, the city's legal department was in full-blown panic mode. The viral videos were a public relations catastrophe. The Monell claim in Carter's lawsuit threatened to open the city up to a massive, politically damaging discovery process that could unearth years of departmental skeletons. They needed to shut this down, and fast. Less than a week after the suit was filed, Ben Carter received a call from Eleanor Vance, the lead counsel for the city. Vance was a sharp, pragmatic lawyer known for her ability to make problems disappear with the city's checkbook. "Ben," she said, her tone businesslike, "I've reviewed the complaint. Obviously, the city contests all the allegations, but we recognize the optics of the situation. My client is prepared to be reasonable. We want to resolve this quickly and amicably." Carter listened, a faint knowing smile on his face. He knew exactly what was coming. "I'm listening." "Eleanor," he said, "to avoid the time and expense of protracted litigation for all parties." Vance continued, "The city is prepared to offer your client a settlement. We're authorizing a payment of $150,000, full expungement of the arrest record, and Ms. Jones will be immediately reinstated from administrative leave with full back pay." It was the classic lowball gambit. The offer was just enough money to seem significant to an ordinary person, but it was a pittance compared to what a jury might award. It was, as Carter later described it to Sarah, nuisance value. It was the cost of making a problem go away, not the cost of justice. It came with an implicit, non-negotiable condition, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would gag Sarah from ever speaking publicly about the case again. Carter relayed the offer to Sarah that afternoon in his office. He laid it out without judgment, explaining the pros and cons. "It's a guaranteed outcome," he said. "A trial is always a risk. Juries are unpredictable. This would be over. You could have your life back next week." Sarah listened, her expression unreadable. She thought about the offer. $150,000. It was more money than she had in her savings. It would pay off her mortgage. But then she thought about what it would buy the city. It would buy their silence. It would allow them to release a statement saying the matter was resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. It would allow Officer Miller to keep his job, his record sanitized by an internal investigation that would inevitably find he acted within departmental guidelines. It would ensure that the systemic problems that allowed a Miller to exist and to thrive would remain buried. The offer wasn't a resolution, it was an erasure. "No," she said, the word coming out quiet but absolute. "Absolutely not." Carter nodded slowly. "I thought you might say that." "Ben, this was never about the money," she continued, leaning forward. "If I take this, what happens the next time a paramedic is in my shoes? What happens when some other cop with an ego gets challenged? They'll know they can bully us, and the worst that will happen is the city writes a check. Nothing will change. My silence is not for sale." Her resolve was steel. She had crossed a threshold. The initial shock and humiliation had burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding principle. She was no longer just a victim of injustice. She was an agent of change. Carter picked up his phone. He dialed Eleanor Vance. The call was brief. "Eleanor, it's Ben Carter. We've reviewed your offer. The answer is no. We'll see you in discovery." He hung up the phone and looked at Sarah. "All right, then," he said, a genuine, predatory smile finally spreading across his face. "Let's go get the evidence." The city had tried to buy peace. Now, they were going to get the war they had tried to avoid. The rejection of the settlement offer shifted the case into a new, more aggressive phase: discovery. It was the part of litigation where both sides are legally compelled to turn over evidence to the other. For the city, it was a nightmare. For Ben Carter, it was a treasure hunt. His team filed a sweeping set of discovery requests, demanding every piece of paper, every email, and every byte of data related to the incident. They asked for Officer Miller's complete personnel file, including every commendation and every citizen complaint. They requested all internal emails and reports about Sarah's arrest. They demanded the department's training manuals on use of force and interagency cooperation. But at the top of the list, the item they demanded with the most urgency was the holy grail of modern police misconduct cases, the body camera footage. The city's lawyers tried to stonewall. They filed motions to delay, claiming the requests were overly broad and burdensome. They argued the body cam footage was part of an ongoing internal investigation and therefore privileged. Carter countered every motion with blistering legal briefs, accusing the city of engaging in a transparent attempt to hide inculpatory evidence. The judge, an experienced, no-nonsense federal magistrate, grew tired of the city's games. He issued a sharp order: produce the footage, now. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a password-protected hard drive to Carter's office. It contained the complete, unedited video from Officer Nathan Miller's body-worn camera. Starting from the moment he arrived on the scene, Carter called Sarah and asked her to come in. "You need to see this," he said. "But I want you to be prepared. It's going to be difficult to watch." They sat together in a small conference room, just the two of them, and Carter clicked play on his laptop. The video flickered to life. The first thing they heard was the sound of Miller's breathing, amplified by the microphone and the crunch of his boots on glass. The camera's wide-angle lens showed the chaotic panorama of the crash scene. Then, the camera panned, and there she was, Sarah, focused, working on David Henderson, her back to the camera. The audio was crystal clear. They heard Miller's first aggressive words, "This your ambulance?" They heard Sarah's calm, professional response, explaining she was loading a critical patient. Watching it from Miller's perspective was a chilling, out-of-body experience for Sarah. She saw herself as he saw her, not as a fellow first responder, but as an obstacle. The camera angle made her seem defiant, her refusal to turn and look at him a sign of disrespect in his world. The audio captured the rising tide of anger in his voice, the condescension in his tone. "Are you refusing a lawful order, ma'am?" The phrase, now recorded in high-fidelity audio, sounded even more menacing than she remembered. The most damning part of the video was what it didn't show. It didn't show Miller ever once looking at the patient. His gaze, and therefore the camera's, was fixed entirely on Sarah. He never bent down to assess the man on the stretcher. He never asked about his condition. He showed zero interest in the medical emergency unfolding just feet away. His entire world consisted of a paramedic who wasn't complying. Then came the moment of the arrest. The camera lurched forward as Miller grabbed her arm. The image became a blur of motion and proximity. They could hear her cry of shock, her voice pleading, "My patient is dying!" The lens was just inches from her face as he shoved her against the ambulance. Then, the sound of the handcuffs, a series of sharp metallic clicks that seemed to echo in the silent conference room. The camera recorded the horrified faces of the firefighters, the sea of cell phones, and finally, Mark's desperate shout from inside the ambulance. "He's coding!" The video kept rolling as Miller marched her to his car. It recorded his venomous, blame-shifting words. "You see what you did? This is your fault." It was all there. His aggression, his tunnel vision, his complete disregard for her professional duty, and his catastrophic impact on a patient's life. It was an unfiltered, unblinking, and utterly devastating account of one man's abuse of power. When the video ended, the room was silent. Sarah sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of sadness this time, but of vindication. "He recorded his own crime," she whispered. Carter simply nodded, his face grim. "Yes, he did," he said, turning the laptop toward him. "And now, this is the centerpiece of our case. This is the weapon that will bring them to their knees." With the body cam footage secured, the next phase of the battle was the depositions. A deposition is sworn testimony taken out of court, a chance for lawyers to question witnesses under oath before a trial. Ben Carter decided to depose Officer Miller first. He wanted to lock Miller into his story before showing him all the evidence they had stacked against him. The deposition took place in a neutral conference room at a court reporting firm. Officer Miller arrived flanked by Eleanor Vance from the city attorney's office and a lawyer from the police union. He wore a crisp suit, not his uniform, and carried himself with a defiant confidence. He clearly believed he had done nothing wrong and that the system would protect him. He was about to learn how wrong he was. For the first hour, Carter was disarmingly gentle. He asked Miller to recount his career history, his training, and his general understanding of police procedure. Miller's answers were textbook, rehearsed. He portrayed himself as a dedicated, by-the-book officer. Then Carter turned to the day of the incident. "Officer Miller, please describe for me your assessment of the accident scene when you arrived." "It was chaotic," Miller said. "Multiple vehicles, debris everywhere. My primary responsibility was to secure the scene and restore order." "And in your view, what was the biggest threat to order at that scene?" Carter asked. "The ambulance," Miller said without hesitation. "It was blocking a lane of traffic, preventing other emergency vehicles from getting through and creating a hazard. So the paramedic treating a dying man wasn't the priority. The position of her vehicle was? Securing the scene is the priority. Everything flows from that," Miller insisted, parroting a line he had clearly been coached to repeat. Carter nodded, making a note on his legal pad. He then had Miller walk him through the entire conversation with Sarah, minute by minute. Miller's version was a masterclass in self-serving revisionism. He painted Sarah as immediately hostile, argumentative, and insubordinate. He claimed he repeatedly asked her to cooperate, but she refused at every turn. He described his decision to arrest her as a last resort, necessary to maintain control of the scene. Having established Miller's official narrative, Carter leaned forward. "Officer Miller, in your personnel file, it notes that in the last 3 years, you've had 5 citizen complaints filed against you, 2 for verbal abuse, 3 for excessive force. All 5 were dismissed after an internal review. Do you recall those?" The union lawyer immediately objected. "Relevance?" Carter smiled. "It speaks to a pattern of behavior, counsel, a tendency to escalate encounters with civilians who question his authority." The objection was noted for the record, but Carter had made his point. He was showing Miller that he knew everything. Then came the body camera footage. "Officer, I'm going to play a video for you, and I'd like you to identify it." Carter turned his laptop around and played the first minute of the footage. Miller's confident facade began to crack. Watching his own actions on screen, hearing his own aggressive words, was clearly unsettling. Carter paused the video. "In that first minute, officer, did you at any point attempt to ascertain the condition of the patient Ms. Jones was treating?" My focus was on the improperly parked vehicle," Miller stammered. "So you made a command decision to prioritize a parking violation over a potential medical fatality?" "It wasn't a parking violation. It was a public safety hazard," Miller shot back, his composure fraying. Carter played another segment, the one showing Miller grabbing Sarah's arm. "Officer, please describe the specific, physical threat Ms. Jones posed to you in that moment that required you to use force." Miller was silent. He stared at the screen, his jaw working. She was turning away from me. She was resisting. She was a paramedic, officer, turning to get into her ambulance to save a dying man's life, Carter said, his voice like ice. Would you agree that your actions physically prevented her from rendering aid? For 6 hours. Carter dismantled him. He used Miller's own video, his own words, and his own personnel file to expose the glaring contradictions in his story. By the end of the day, Officer Nathan Miller was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, defensive anger. He had walked into the room a confident police officer. He walked out a legal liability, his credibility shattered, his career hanging by a thread. The deposition transcript, a verbatim record of his unraveling, was now another powerful weapon in Ben Carter's arsenal. The city had based its defense on the word of its officer, and Carter had just proven that his word was worthless. If Officer Miller's deposition was about destroying the city's narrative, the next deposition was about building an unshakable foundation for their own. The witness was Dr. Alistair Finch, the chief of trauma surgery at University Medical Center. He was the man who had held David Henderson's life in his hands. Doctor. Finch was in his late 50s, with a reputation for being a brilliant surgeon and an absolutely terrible witness for any lawyer trying to twist the facts. He dealt in the cold, hard certainties of medicine and had no patience for ambiguity. He arrived for his deposition at Carter's office looking annoyed, as if the entire legal process was an inconvenient distraction from his real work of saving lives. Eleanor Vance, the city's attorney, started the questioning. Her strategy was clear: to establish that David Henderson's injuries were so severe from the crash itself that the few minutes of delay caused by Sarah's arrest were medically insignificant. Doctor, she began. Mr. Henderson suffered a traumatic aortic transection in the collision. Correct? A partial transection. Yes. Doctor. Finch corrected her immediately. A tear, not a full rupture. There's a critical distinction. But it was a life-threatening injury, sustained at the moment of impact? Potentially life-threatening, yes. Like many severe trauma injuries, it created a state of extreme vulnerability. The patient's survival depended entirely on prompt and appropriate pre-hospital and surgical care. Vance pressed on, trying to get him to agree that death was a likely outcome, regardless of the delay. So, in cases like this, the outcome is often poor, isn't it? The mortality rate for these injuries is extremely high. Doctor, Finch looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. The mortality rate for patients who don't get to an operating room in time is nearly 100%. The mortality rate for those who do and who are properly managed in the field to prevent shock is significantly lower. The entire principle of modern trauma care is built on speed and stabilization. We call it the golden hour for a reason. Counselor. Vance wasn't making any headway. She decided to change tactics. Doctor, are you aware that the patient went into cardiac arrest at the scene? Yes. I've reviewed the paramedic's run sheet. And isn't it true that a cardiac arrest significantly worsens a patient's prognosis? Of course. Doctor, Finch said, his voice dripping with impatience. But you have the sequence of events backward. He didn't just go into cardiac arrest. He went into cardiac arrest because he entered profound hemorrhagic shock. The delay in transport, the period where he was not being actively managed by two paramedics preparing him for transport, allowed his blood pressure to drop to a point where his heart could no longer compensate. The partial tear in his aorta became a full-blown rupture. The arrest was the result of the delay, not some random, unfortunate event. It was a devastating blow to the city's case. Their own expert witness was now explaining, in precise medical terms, how the arrest had directly caused the patient's most catastrophic turn for the worse. When it was Ben Carter's turn to question the surgeon, His approach was different. He wasn't trying to trap him. He was trying to build a clear, simple story for the jury. Doctor, I want to be very clear about the timeline. We have telemetry records and dispatch logs showing a delay of approximately 7 minutes between when Ms. Jones was first prevented from loading her patient and when a second ambulance crew was able to depart the scene. In your professional opinion, what is the significance of 7 minutes for a patient in Mr. Henderson's condition? Doctor. Finch leaned back in his chair. 7 minutes? He repeated, his voice filled with a surgeon's contempt for wasted time. Counselor, in my operating room, we measure success and failure in increments of 30 seconds. 7 minutes for a patient with a leaking aorta is the difference between a controllable surgical problem and an uncontrollable hemorrhage. It is the difference between life and death. It's the difference between walking out of a hospital and being wheeled out to the morgue. He wasn't being dramatic. He was simply stating a fact. Carter had one last question. Doctor, Finch, in your expert medical opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, did the 7-minute delay in transport directly contribute to the catastrophic decline of Mr. Henderson's condition and the permanent damage he has sustained? Doctor. Finch didn't hesitate. He looked directly at the court reporter, ensuring his words were captured perfectly. It wasn't a contributing factor, he said, his voice like granite. It was the proximate cause. The delay is the reason Mr. Henderson will likely never work again. The delay is the reason he has cognitive deficits from the time his brain was deprived of oxygen. The delay is the reason he is alive today by sheer luck and the skill of about 20 different people in my hospital. Another 2 minutes, and he would have been dead on arrival. The deposition was over. The city's defense was not just wounded, it was dead on the table. With depositions complete and no new settlement offer forthcoming, the path led inexorably to a federal courtroom. The city, trapped by the police union's refusal to concede any wrongdoing on Miller's part, was forced to take the case to trial. It was a monumental gamble, but their hands were tied. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Media from local and national outlets filled the benches, alongside off-duty paramedics and police officers who sat on opposite sides of the aisle like feuding families. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with Ben Carter and his team. She wore a simple, professional navy blue suit, her demeanor calm and composed, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. At the defense table, Officer Nathan Miller sat stiffly beside Eleanor Vance, his face a stony mask. The jury selection process had taken 2 days. Carter and Vance had carefully vetted potential jurors, each looking for people who might be sympathetic to their side. Carter looked for independent thinkers, people in helping professions, and minorities who might have their own experiences with police overreach. Vance looked for law and order types, people with family in law enforcement, those who showed a strong deference to authority. In the end, they seated a jury of 8 women and 4 men, a diverse cross-section of the community whose faces revealed nothing. After the jury was sworn in, the trial began with opening statements. Eleanor Vance went first. She stood before the jury and painted a picture of a chaotic, dangerous scene. She portrayed Officer Miller as a young, decisive officer trying to restore order and protect public safety. She described Sarah as an agitated and uncooperative individual who, in the heat of the moment, refused to comply with a simple, lawful instruction. She argued that David Henderson's tragic outcome was the sole result of the violent car crash, and that the city and its dedicated police officers bore no responsibility. It was a competent, if predictable, defense. Then it was Ben Carter's turn. He walked not to the podium, but to the edge of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a calm, deliberate tone, as if explaining a complex but important story to a group of neighbors. "This is not a case about a chaotic accident scene," he began. "And it's not a case about disrespecting the police. This is a case about a sacred duty, the duty of a paramedic to her patient. And what happens when that sacred duty collides with a fragile ego and a badge?" He told the story from Sarah's perspective, describing her 17 years of service, her focus on her patient, and the impossible situation she was placed in. He didn't vilify Officer Miller. Instead, he painted him as a man who, on that day, made a catastrophic choice. "He had a choice," Carter said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "He could have chosen to help. He could have chosen to listen. He could have chosen to recognize that the woman in the paramedic's uniform was an expert in her field, doing a job he was not trained to do. But he didn't. He chose his authority over her expertise. He chose his ego over a citizen's life." Carter then walked over to a large monitor that had been set up facing the jury. "In a moment," he said, "you are going to see a video. It was recorded by Officer Miller's own body camera. It is not easy to watch, but it is the truth. And I want you to watch it. And ask yourselves a simple question. Who was serving the public in this video, and who was serving only himself?" He pressed a button, and the footage began to play. The courtroom was silent, captivated. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes glued to the screen. They saw the scene from Miller's perspective. They heard his aggressive tone. They saw him ignore the dying patient. They saw him grab Sarah. They saw him force her against the ambulance. And they heard the sickening final click of the handcuffs. Carter stopped the video right there. He let the image of Sarah in handcuffs, her face a mask of disbelief and anguish, burn into the jurors' minds. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "That," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is what this case is about. The evidence will show that on that day, Officer Nathan Miller didn't stop a crime. He committed one." He walked back to his table and sat down. The trial had just begun, but in the faces of the jurors, he could already see that the storm had broken. 2 days into the trial, after testimony from the firefighter captain and a bystander who had filmed the arrest, Ben Carter called his star witness. The plaintiff calls Sarah Jones to the stand. Sarah walked from the counsel table to the witness box with a steady, measured pace. She took the oath, her voice clear and unwavering. For the jury, this was the first time they would hear directly from the woman at the center of the case. Carter began his direct examination gently, establishing her background. He had her describe her training, her years of service, the commendations she had received. He was building a foundation of credibility, showing the jury that this was not a hothead or a malcontent, but a dedicated, experienced professional. Then he turned to the day of the crash. "Ms. Jones, can you describe the condition of your patient, Mr. Henderson, when you first reached him?" Sarah's demeanor shifted. She was no longer a plaintiff in a lawsuit. She was a paramedic describing a call. Her language became clinical, precise. He presented with paradoxical chest movement, indicating a flail chest. His breath sounds were diminished on the left side, suggesting a pneumothorax. He was tachycardic and hypotensive, classic signs of shock, likely from internal bleeding. He was a critical, load-and-go trauma patient. She spoke without notes. The details seared into her memory. She was teaching the jury, explaining not just what she did, but why she did it. "And why?" Carter asked. "Was it so important to avoid any delay in transporting him?" "In trauma care, we have the concept of the golden hour," she explained. "A patient like Mr. Henderson is bleeding internally. There is nothing I can do in the field to stop that. My job is to get him to a surgeon as fast as humanly possible." Every minute lost on scene is a minute he is bleeding to death. Carter then walked her, step by step, through the encounter with Officer Miller. Her testimony was a powerful counterpoint to the body cam footage the jury had already seen, where the video showed her from Miller's aggressive perspective. Her words filled in the internal monologue of a medic focused solely on her patient. "When he told me to move the ambulance, what was your immediate thought?" Carter asked. "My immediate thought was for my patient," Sarah said. "All I could think was that this man was trying to get me to stop saving a life to go move a truck. It didn't make any sense. It was a violation of every protocol for scene management I've ever been taught." She described the moment of her arrest with a quiet, dignified pain. "What were you thinking when he put the handcuffs on you?" "I was thinking that David Henderson was going to die," she said, her voice thick with emotion for the first time. "And that I was being stopped from helping him. It was the most helpless I have ever felt in my entire career." Her testimony was devastatingly effective. She never raised her voice. She never attacked Officer Miller directly. She simply stated the facts of her duty and how he had prevented her from performing it. When it was Eleanor Vance's turn for cross-examination, she approached the witness stand with a strategy of trying to poke holes in Sarah's professionalism. "Ms. Jones," Vance began, "you were in a stressful situation. Is it possible that you misread the officer's tone?" "No," Sarah replied calmly. "His tone was aggressive and unprofessional. And when he gave you a lawful order, you chose to ignore it, didn't you?" "I chose to obey my primary lawful order," Sarah corrected her, "which is my duty as a licensed paramedic to provide care and transport to a critical patient. That duty supersedes a request to move a vehicle." Vance tried to twist her words, to paint her as arrogant. "So you believe your judgment is superior to that of a sworn police officer securing a dangerous scene?" Sarah looked directly at the jury. "At a medical emergency, when it comes to a patient's clinical needs, yes, my medical judgment is superior to that of a police officer. That is what I am trained and licensed to do." The answer was so direct, so logical, that it left Vance with nowhere to go. She tried a few more questions, but Sarah's poise was unshakable. Her testimony was grounded in the undeniable logic of her profession. Patients come first. After less than 15 minutes, Vance gave up. "No further questions, Your Honor." Sarah walked back to her table, her head held high. She had told her truth. It was now up to the jury to recognize it. The trial lasted 7 days. Ben Carter presented a methodical, ironclad case. After Sarah's testimony, he called Dr. Finch, who repeated his damning deposition testimony for the jury, explaining in stark terms how the 7-minute delay had been a death sentence, narrowly commuted. Carter's final witness was an expert on police practices, a retired police chief who testified that Officer Miller's actions violated nationally recognized standards for interagency cooperation at emergency scenes. The defense's case was weak and brief. Eleanor Vance called Officer Miller to the stand. He was stiff and defensive, repeating the same rehearsed lines from his deposition. But under Carter's blistering cross-examination, he once again became flustered and combative, his carefully constructed narrative falling apart under the weight of his own body cam footage. His testimony did his case more harm than good. In his closing argument, Carter put it all together for the jury. He played short, powerful clips from the body cam video, juxtaposing Miller's rage with Sarah's calm professionalism. He reminded them of Dr. Finch's chilling testimony. He ended by returning to his central theme. "This case is about a line," he said, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. "The line between authority and abuse, the line between enforcing the law and breaking it. On that day, on that highway, Officer Nathan Miller crossed that line. He traded his oath to protect and serve for a moment of power. He put his ego before a man's life, and in doing so, he not only violated Sarah Jones's civil rights, he betrayed the trust we place in every person who wears a badge. He gestured to Sarah. Your verdict will not undo the damage done to Mr. Henderson. It will not erase the humiliation Miss Jones endured. But it will send a message. It will reaffirm that in this country, no one is above the law. It will tell every first responder that their sacred duty to save lives is protected. And it will tell every police department that accountability is not a choice. It is a requirement. Fine for the plaintiff. Hold them accountable. The jury filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The wait was excruciating. Sarah sat with Carter in a small conference room, the silence stretching for hours. Every possible outcome ran through her head. What if they didn't believe her? What if they sided with the officer? The financial stakes were high. But what truly hung in the balance was her reputation, her sense of justice, and the principle she had fought for. After just 4 hours, an astonishingly short time for such a complex case, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom reassembled, a palpable tension in the air. Sarah's hands were trembling under the table. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. The jury filed back into the box. Their faces were grim, unreadable. The forewoman, a middle-aged schoolteacher, handed the verdict form to the clerk. The judge reviewed it and handed it back. In the matter of Jones versus Miller and the city, on the claim of violation of the Fourth Amendment, how do you find? The clerk asked. We find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jones, the forewoman said, her voice clear and strong. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of violation of the 14th Amendment, how do you find? We find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jones. On the claim of interference with emergency medical services, how do you find? We find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jones. It was a clean sweep. Sarah felt the tears welling in her eyes as Carter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But the clerk wasn't finished. And what damages do you award? The forewoman took a breath. The jury awards compensatory damages in the amount of $2,600,000, and we award punitive damages against Officer Miller and the city in the amount of $10 million. The number hung in the air, stunning the courtroom into silence. $12.6 million. It wasn't just a verdict, it was an earthquake. It was a historic rebuke of a police officer and the department that had enabled him. The silence was broken by a sob. It came from Sarah. All the pain, the humiliation, the fear, and the righteous anger of the past months poured out of her. Ben Carter wrapped an arm around her, his own eyes shining with emotion. Across the room, Officer Miller stared blankly, his face ashen. A man whose life had just been irrevocably broken by a jury of his peers. The message had been sent, and it had been heard across the nation. The aftermath of the verdict was swift and decisive. The city, facing a staggering judgment and a public relations disaster of its own making, did not appeal. The police union, which had staunchly defended Miller, issued a terse statement expressing its disappointment with the verdict, but offered no further support. 2 weeks later, following the conclusion of the internal affairs investigation that had been conveniently stalled until after the trial, Police Chief Michaels announced that Officer Nathan Miller had been terminated from the police force for gross misconduct, violations of departmental policy, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. The price of his ego was his career. But the changes didn't stop there. Under immense pressure from the city council and a coalition of community groups, Chief Michaels announced a sweeping series of reforms. The centerpiece was a new departmental directive for interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes. It explicitly stated that the senior medical personnel on scene had authority over patient care decisions, and that law enforcement was to assist, not interfere. Any officer who detained or arrested a paramedic or EMT for actions taken in the performance of their medical duties would face an immediate investigation and potential termination. The directive was officially named General Order 2024-17, but everyone in the city, cops and medics alike, knew it by its unofficial name, the Jones Protocol. Sarah's case became a landmark. Law schools used it to teach civil rights litigation. Police academies across the country incorporated the body cam footage into their de-escalation and bias training. A stark example of how not to handle a professional disagreement. Paramedic and EMT training programs began adding modules on the legal rights and duties of medics at contested scenes, empowering them to stand their ground for their patients. Sarah, who had never sought the spotlight, had become a reluctant icon. She used a portion of her settlement to create a foundation dedicated to providing legal support for first responders who faced retaliation or obstruction in the line of duty. Her story gave countless others the courage to report misconduct, knowing they were not alone. David Henderson, the man at the center of it all, had survived. He had emerged from his coma after 3 long weeks, his body and mind forever scarred by the ordeal. He would never work in construction again. His life was a testament to both the miracle of modern medicine and the devastating, long-lasting consequences of one police officer's terrible decision. His family sent Sarah a letter, a simple, heartfelt note of thanks, which she kept tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of why she had fought so hard. Months after the trial, long after the news cameras had moved on, Sarah sat on her back porch as the sun set, the letter from the Henderson family in her hand. The chaos had subsided, leaving a quiet space for reflection. She thought about Nathan Miller, not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical pity. What leads a young man, entrusted with so much power, to abuse it so profoundly? Perhaps it was insecurity, a deep-seated need to prove his authority in a world that felt chaotic. He likely saw the world as a nail and his badge as the only hammer. When confronted with Sarah, a calm, competent black woman who was an authority in her own right, who did not immediately bend to his will, his entire world view was threatened. His reaction wasn't that of a peacekeeper, but of a fragile ego lashing out against a perceived slight. He didn't see a paramedic saving a life. He saw a challenge that had to be dominated. She sometimes wondered what could have been different. If she had been a man, or white, would he have treated her with the professional courtesy she deserved? Almost certainly. If she had worn her own body cam, would the clear evidence of his aggression have made him think twice? It was a powerful thought, a tool for future protection. But speculating on how she could have managed his rage felt like accepting a portion of the blame, and she refused to do that. The fault was his alone. Her protection, ultimately, came not from anything she could have done differently in those frantic minutes, but from the legal battle that followed. The real lesson was that standing firm on principle, armed with the truth and good counsel, was the only way to force a broken system to reckon with itself. The story of that day on the highway wasn't just about a bad cop and a good paramedic. It was a reminder that true authority is not demanded at the end of a threat. It is earned through competence, respect, and a commitment to a duty greater than oneself. In a moment of crisis, the most important law is the preservation of human life. The verdict was not a lottery win. It was a painful, public validation of that simple, sacred principle. It was a price the city had to pay to relearn a lesson it should never have forgotten. This case has resonated with so many people. We often see these events on the news. But what do you think is the real-world impact of a verdict like this on the daily interactions between police and other first responders? Have you ever witnessed a situation where authority was challenged for the right reasons? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories.